Welcome to RichPlanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Today's guest contends that free energy technology has been weaponized and was used on the day of 9/11 to disintegrate the World Trade Center towers. He also contends that it is this undisclosed black technology which is the main factor behind the 9/11 cover-up. If the scientific community and public at large were to learn that this technology exists and that it could be used to provide the world with free energy, this would then neutralize the scarcity and fear agenda that the global elite uses to keep the human race in check. Welcome, Andrew Johnson.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that excellent introduction.
Now then, we're here to talk primarily about your book, 9/11 Finding the Truth, which is in its third edition. Can briefly just start, Andrew, what motivated you to write this work?
Yeah, well, we've mentioned this in passing before, and really I became involved with the Scholars for 9/11 Truth group, which I think we're going to discuss, which is kind of like part of the 9/11 Truth movement. And I became unhappy with things that were going on in there. And then I became aware of Dr. Judy Wood's research, which, I'm thanking you for your support with in that arena. And I, once I got involved with that, there became a need, as I saw things, to document what was actually going on, because I saw that certain people were acting to try and keep that research marginalised, and that's what I wanted to document.
Okay, so you've documented a lot of correspondence because you were closely involved with various different scientists who were involved in trying to find the truth about 9/11, and you believe that some of those people aren't quite what they seem, as you spell out in your book. We'll come on to the book, but there may well be people watching this show who still believe that hijackers in large aircraft flew planes into the World Trade Center and that then caused them to fall. And I was just looking on the internet to prepare for this interview, Andrew, and the BBC, they still have their original news report on their website, which is from the 13th of September. This is 2 days after 9/11, and it says in their little, very scientific diagram here of the towers, it says, "Fire reaches 800 degrees C, hot enough to melt steel floor supports." And then the towers then collapse. We know that steel melts at over 1300 degrees C. Right. So this really, 2 days after these towers literally disappeared, and the BBC think that they know how it happened. Compare that with this 500-page, 800-colour photograph book, which is 5 years of research from a professor of mechanical engineering, Dr. Judy Wood. Which one are you going to believe, folks? I know which one I believe, so we'll just get rid of this out of the way. Okay. Now, so just to summarise Dr. Wood's analysis and investigation, she claims, or she has demonstrated, that there are various reasons why the towers didn't even collapse. They literally turned to dust in mid-air. Can you give us the main bullet points? Because we're not really here to discuss this book. Viewers can watch the interviews that I did with Dr. Judy Wood from the richplanet.net website. But just the bullet points, Andrew, as to why the towers did not pancake collapse and they weren't controlled via standard controlled demolition.
Right, absolutely. And I'll just make one additional point that, if you listen to the Fox News broadcast, going back to the BBC thing and so on, they'd solved 9/11 45 seconds after the second plane had impacted, and already we're mentioning Osama bin Laden 45 seconds after the supposed second impact. But to come on to Dr. Wood's book, which you so carefully described, the main things of evidence that are in there are, for example, the buildings turning to dust, and the amount of dust, and the fact that you can watch videos and see steel girders actually turning to dust in the seconds that they're travelling from the top of the building to the bottom. You can actually see that. The lack of a seismic signature, in other words, whether you go with the official story of the pancake collapse and so on, or whether you go with this later story which was put into the ether, around about 2002, 2003, of bombs in the buildings. We call it BIB, bombs in the building. The building, in either of those two sets of circumstances, would have hit the ground.
Basically, it would have clattered
Right.
to the floor over a period of well over a minute.
Yeah,
As
something
it's
like,
explained
yeah,
in the, so
yeah.
you would have had a seismic trace up and down
Right,
for
right.
over a minute, and it was less than 8 seconds, and it was barely it was
But
practically non-existent.
yeah, well, it was much smaller. I mean, Dr. Wood goes into the book and compares it with the Seattle Kingdom, which was very well recorded in terms of video, photographs, what was on the ground afterwards, and also the seismic signature. And she compares that with the World Trade Center, which were much taller buildings and so on. So she has that direct comparison looking at the scientific data for those two things, and they clearly do not match up. There's a very large discrepancy between the two, which indicates from the seismic signal to the building didn't hit the ground. One of the other issues that came up was the bathtub. The World Trade Center towers were constructed inside a bathtub of concrete because some land was reclaimed from the Hudson River during the construction of the towers. And this structure was not substantially damaged. There was a small amount of damage, but compared to the conflagration which of the buildings coming down, or what was claimed, there was virtually no damage to the structure.
Now, I was sitting in the pub reading your book, Andrew, a few days ago, and a guy comes sit next to me. He said, "Do you mind if I ask what you do?" So I always dread that question, actually, because I never know what to say. So I told him, and he said, "Oh, that's interesting." And he says, "Well, I work in demolition." And he said, "I never believed what I saw on TV. I mean, he demolishes pubs and houses and things like that, not huge structures. But what he said was he couldn't understand how the towers had any damage at all below where the damage was. So he could understand why things might topple over, etc., or become damaged above where the damage, I'll not say the plane, but where the damage occurred.
The holes appeared, yeah.
Everything up to the point where the damage occurred should just be structurally sound. It should not fall over or disappear, which is what we saw. Right, now let's, just one general comment about 9/11. I mentioned Bill Hicks on last week's show, and he was famous for often talking about the Kennedy assassination and the Kennedy conspiracy, and people would often say to him, "Quit talking about Kennedy, Bill. Leave it alone." And this is very much what 9/11 is, I fear, is becoming. People are, rather than demanding that people get put before a court or justice is served, they're talking about it with their after-dinner liqueurs now. It's becoming popular culture.
Right.
I mean, is there a danger that it's going to become like the Kennedy assassination?
Well, I think inevitably it has, and I think it will continue to be like that. And I think also what was interesting to us, having done all this research, was that earlier this year, the death of bin Laden was announced formally on the media. I think it was around about April, I can't remember the exact date. And so
May the 1st, I think it was.
Right. So it was almost as if that was the powers that be saying, right, that's 9/11 done with now. We can move on from 9/11 on to whatever the next thing would be. So I think that sort of encouraged that mindset that you referred to. That encourages people then to say, well, we don't need to talk about 9/11 now because bin Laden's dead and so on, and so it's really just ancient history now. And it is, of course, 10 years, and it came in the 10th anniversary year, didn't it? So I look at that as kind of backing up that kind of mindset that you were referring to.
Well, let's talk about your book now. And having read this, Andrew, it just becomes apparent what a battle you've been involved in over the last 5 or 6 years. It really, you are Judy Wood's pit bull terrier. That's the impression I get by reading this, and it's. It must be, well, even slightly traumatic for you over the last. Just from reading your book, that you really, it really has been a battle of wills.
It's definitely been a battle, and I think I've described this as a numbers game. I mean, essentially, to summarise what's going on is perception management, and I think this is happening in all these fields that you cover in your program, where you get. There's important information, underlying a lot of these topics that we're looking at. Very, very important information, which will and should change the world, and the perception of that knowledge and that truth needs to be carefully managed. And I think what I came to realising in going through what I went through, essentially trying to prevent Judy Wood's research from being marginalised in the only way I could. that's what it was all about. That I could see that there was this group of people, some of them I could clearly identify and clearly state what they were up to, and some I couldn't quite state as clearly, that they were trying to keep Judy Wood's research marginalised, keep it in the you know, that it was ridiculous, it was incredible, that people wouldn't believe it, and we shouldn't talk about it. And one of the themes of that, which I encountered and still encounter, is that you know, if you're telling people, for example, that there are bombs in the building, that's kind of believable, but people can understand that. And if you want to question the official hijacker story of 9/11, then if you go to the bombs in the building or some variant thereof, that's a fairly safe position because people are comfortable with that. But if you're going to tell people that there was energy weapons involved, and some people then immediately come out with this description of space beams, for example, which has been attached to Judy Wood's research quite successfully, they will then say, well, you can't tell people about that because that will bring the truth movement into disrepute. People won't believe it. It's incredible. So don't talk about it. And I think it's that those are sort of two of the main sort of themes which came out from writing the articles that I did.
Okay, now let's come on to some of the characters that you mentioned in your book. Some of them are scientists, some of them are not, and they're all essentially people who have been trying to find out the truth about 9/11, or who claim that that's what they've been trying to do. But you believe that some of them are working for, indirectly probably, the people who orchestrated it, in that they're some kind of agent. That they're there to infiltrate a truth movement. And you contend that the 9/11 cover-up is a double cover-up. It's such an important issue that there were millions of people don't believe the official story.
Right.
So there was another layer of falsehood put into the story, which was that the towers were destroyed by controlled demolition, which is what the majority of the truth movement probably still buys into. And the key instigator of that second cover-up is a guy called Professor Steve Jones, according to you. So if we go back to 2006, just tell us about the formation of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, because Jones was involved in that, along with Dr. Judy Wood and Jim Fetzer and others. Just tell us about that group, because you were all a bit of a happy family initially, weren't you?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I took the view, basically, what I'd been doing in the run-up to that scholars group being formed. I didn't have anything to do with its formation, but I had basically put down a little calculation about the free fall, which is very simple. You know, you use the laws of motion, S equals ut plus a half at squared, which is one of the equations of motion which you study at in your physics A level, or I don't know if they still do it at GCSE now. But
V squared equals u squared plus 2as as well.
That's one of the other equations of motion. That's right. That's it. And so, you know, you can derive from that the free fall time of the towers based on the acceleration due to gravity and so on. It's a very, very simple calculation when you know how to do it. And I'd been posting that around various forums, one of which was a physics forum, and that generated a couple of thousand responses, I think, over a period of about a year, 18 months or so. And I have a feeling that because I was trying to approach it from that angle, somebody was, you know, looking out for the people on the internet that were doing that.
Right.
And I got an email from Stephen E. Jones at the end of 2005, I believe it was December. I didn't put that email in the book because it didn't. I started the story after then, really. But he invited me, and he copied this Jim Fetzer, one of the other figures in this, who was a professor at Duluth University. They basically invited me to join this scholars group. Now, it transpired later that this scholars group seemed to have been formed after a meeting between David Ray Griffin and Dr. Judy Wood, and she's spoken about this, that she had a meeting with him in, I think, about July 2005, around that sort of time. And Dr. Judy Wood gave David Ray Griffin her card, and she said, well, we need to get some scholars together to, you know, to actually question the official story and so on. And it was then, at the end of 2005, that this group formed. Now, it turned out later that Stephen E. Jones, I found out about a year after this, that he was connected to the cold fusion research in 1989. And that was a very interesting connection because that had a direct connection into energy, the energy issues. But basically, yes, I was invited to join the scholars group, and I thought, hooray, hooray, you know, some academics are actually trying to do something now after, you know, sort of 4 years of just nothing really. And then they started to write press releases, and they started to make statements in the public arena with apparently some academic clout behind them. And that really lasted for about a year or so. And then as far as I was concerned, but then in August 2006, in other words, about 8 months after I joined the group, Dr. Judy Wood and Dr. Morgan Reynolds published this article because they were very unhappy that Stephen E. Jones had been promoting that thermite was one of the main causes of the destruction of the buildings. Thermite is not an explosive, and when Jones put this into his presentation in February 2006, he said thermite plus other explosives. And I bought into the thermite story initially because I'd assumed that people like Jones and Fetzer, as you were saying in the introduction, were legitimate scientists or legitimate academics, and their agenda was to find out the truth of what happened. And indeed, in the scholars group, I think it was Jim Fetzer said, we're a group of academics, we want to investigate 9/11 and let the chips fall where they may. And that was kind of like, well, that to me was saying, well, we don't mind where this goes, we don't mind where the information goes, as long as we follow it, we're going to find the truth. That to me was their ethos, which of course I agreed with.
And Morgan Reynolds, he's a physicist, yeah?
No, Morgan Reynolds is actually an economist.
All right.
They basically, both of them were questioning the thermite story.
Right.
They were the only two. All the other
Judy
scholars,
Wood. Right,
yeah,
okay.
Dr. Judy Wood and Dr. Morgan Reynolds were essentially questioning the thermite story. And Dr. Wood had various debates with Stephen E. Jones in email. And why are you saying this with thermite when we don't really have enough evidence at this point to say that, yet you're claiming that that's what was used. And then Jones published this paper, which Dr. Judy Wood certainly didn't endorse, and he published that at the end of 2005, and I was one of the reviewers on that. And with my limited knowledge at that time, I couldn't see anything wrong with it. And now I look back and I think how silly I was. And one of the key factors that I found out later was that Stephen E. Jones asked for help with producing this video clip, which he claimed showed thermite, reacting in the towers just before the so-called collapse. And I edited this video clip together for him from two segments one was on Camera Planet and one was somewhere else. And he asked me to do that, and I sent him it because he said he was going to do a PowerPoint presentation. And I then later realised that this helps to understand how these groups work. I was used to put out disinformation because I now know from Dr. Wood's research that thermite had nothing to do with the destruction of the towers.
Okay. And then eventually that group splintered.
Right.
And Fetzer, Wood and Reynolds, they formed their own group.
Right.
And then Jones kept on with the original group, is that
well,
right?
Essentially what happened was, that's almost right. Jim Fetzer, originally, he kicked out Judy Wood and Morgan Reynolds from the scholars group for being too controversial, because Morgan Reynolds had produced this paper about how there were anomalies with the plane crashes at the World Trade Center, implying that what hit the towers wasn't planes.
Basically, there was very little deceleration on impact. That was
right,
one
that
of
was
the
one of the main
things.
factors,
Yeah.
exactly. And Jim Fetzer claimed that this was far too controversial for the scholars group, and therefore they didn't want to associate. And Dr. Wood was talking about energy weapons. No, that was too controversial.
She wrote a paper called the Beam Weapons.
Star Wars Beam Weapon was what its original title was, yeah. Yeah. And that, of course, then attracted later sort of criticism of that. But because of the way she'd done that, and she's spoken about this, she didn't, because she was seeing all these strange effects, she didn't really know what to call it. She knew it wasn't explosives, she knew it wasn't a gravity fire collapse, so she was a bit lost to know what to call it. All she could see was the energy effects at that point, and that was sort of between 2004 and 2006.
Now then, Andrew, we mentioned some names: Fetzer, Dr. Judy Wood, and Dr. Stephen E. Jones. So that Wood and Fetzer and Reynolds, they formed another group. What was that group called?
Well, basically what happened was there was an argument over the website name, and then this Fred Burke's character was involved with that as well. And I'll mention Fred Burke's because he's also got a website called wanttoknow.info, which is commonly referred to. And he has stuff about mind control and the Disclosure Project. He has stuff about that. But Fred Burke's, he was involved in setting up the initial scholars group domain name, and Fetzer disclosed that information that Fred Burke's owned the domain name. And Fred Burks wouldn't give the domain name back to Jim Fetzer, and there was this sort of argument about it or something. I can't remember all the details, but so there was that going on. It was like you could see that there was this, the arguments became not about 9/11, but about how the group should be run and all this sort of thing. And Jim Fetzer, he said, well, I'm going to support, essentially what he said was, he didn't say this literally, but I'm sticking with Judy Wood because of her description of the building, to me, is more sensible how it turned to dust. And he agreed with that at that point, but he still didn't, particularly agree with Morgan Reynolds and the plane issue. That kind of came a bit later. So it was really Jim Fetzer that formed the split. And he kept the Scholars for 9/11 Truth name, and then Stephen E. Jones says, well, I can't associate with Judy Wood anymore. Again, he didn't say that literally, but that he wanted to form this other website, and that was called Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice. And that, I think most of the people in the Scholars group were reluctant to go forward with the Judy Wood material for whatever reason. I didn't speak to them individually. However, one of them, who was called Frank Legge, he wrote to me later on in April 2007 privately and said, are you really sure you want to have that article about molten aluminium on your website? I think it's misleading. And this Frank Legge, he's a PhD in, I think he's out of Australia. And I'm thinking, why is this guy writing to me? Why is he writing to me about what's on my website? And I asked him that question. Well, why my website? I just have this little website. It doesn't get a lot of traffic. He seemed really concerned about this thing with the molten metal, right. and I had a little discussion with him. It became clear to me that a number of people weren't happy with me and others, trying to support what Judy Wood was doing and her research. And it seemed through 2007 that Jim Fetzer was supportive of Dr. Judy Wood's research. And if you go and look at the archives, you will find quite a number of broadcasts with Fetzer and Dr. Wood going through her research, such as the energy effects, the piles of dirt which mysteriously appeared on the World Trade Center site, and what why it was probable that those appeared, and the bathtub study and so on.
Jim Fetzer is still very active in 9/11 Truth.
He is,
and also 7/7. He's interviewed Muad'Dib and people like that.
Right.
So he's very much promotes the fact that false flag terror is something which isn't right and needs to be exposed. I mean, out of all of the people you name in your book, I would say I've actually got a statement which I'll read this. I'll read this out 1 second. Page 303. This might be very controversial to some people.
No, I hope it is.
In conclusion, I will say that due to the evidence I have compiled, I have come to consider Jim Fetzer as a 9/11 disinformation operative. How ironic! That's quite a big statement, Andrew.
Yeah, well,
I mean, I would 100% go with the fact that Steve Jones is. It's as plain as the nose on your face. But Fetzer, a lot of people would disagree with you on that, Andrew.
They will, and they do, and I have sort of public debates about this with, Nick Colostrom, for example. He's been on Jim Fetzer's radio program a couple of times, and I've spoken to Nick at some length about that. And I've also gone further. That's one statement in my book that you just read out, but I have another, and I think that Jim Fetzer has some connection to the people that did 9/11. And I've put that in the book and on my articles.
Well, Fetzer, he stayed close with Judy Wood right the way through over many years and supporting her research.
About two years, yeah.
And it was when she became aware of John Hutchinson's research. That was really when Fetzer wasn't happy, because Fetzer thinks John Hutchinson is a fraud. Just for the viewer, John Hutchinson is a maverick researcher, let's call him that. Are you happy with that explanation? Who experimented with electric fields and radio waves and would cause interference of radio waves inside a strong electric field and create effects on metals, get metals to levitate, get metals to change, seemingly melt at low temperature, all these weird effects. And Judy Wood believes that those same effects are something very similar is what was happening to the World Trade Center towers. Now she then started doing radio interviews with Hutchinson, And that, well, it wasn't. There's a bit more to it than that, because there's another character called Ace Baker who was instrumental in trying to debunk the John Hutchinson work. Just tell us about Ace Baker and where he fits into it.
I'd like to just mention about Jim Fetzer though, because I did an article about the witnesses to planes at the World Trade Center. If you go back and read the witness accounts of the plane crashes, the second plane crash particularly, you'll find some very strange accounts in the witness record, which was gathered by the New York Times over a period of a couple of years. Some very strange accounts. And then if you match that up with the physical evidence, it looks pretty much as if whatever was seen at the World Trade Center they weren't real planes, they weren't real Boeing jets, something else was going on there. And I know you've obviously done your ball analysis, which sort of goes into that territory from a slightly different perspective. And you can see from that analysis that the plane issue is, you've got to...
We'll come on to that. I'll mention that a bit later. Yeah.
Right. And so Fetzer was quite happy to discuss that with me, and he said to me at the end of the program, I think this is really good, and I think you've done a great job collating all these accounts and analysing them, because I made a database and all of this, I spent a couple of weeks doing it, and he was like really complimentary, and he actually rang me up after the end of the broadcast and said, "Oh, it's great to have you in the Scholars Group, Andrew, and I'm really, really glad to have you in." And later, I think the reason why he said that was he truly was glad to have me in, because that's where he could control me, or at least where he thought he could control me. And the same with Judy Wood, because if you can get Judy Wood to appear on his radio program, which has a small number of listeners, maybe maximum of a couple of thousand tops, then her material isn't really going to go anywhere where it's going to do any quote unquote harm. If you're containing it within that sphere of audience, and she's quite comfortable with that, then you've got her under control essentially. And as you mentioned, then after that continued for a period of about 6 months, and we want perhaps just briefly mention the Ambrose Lane program, because Dr. Wood and I were first scheduled to go in July 2007 on the Ambrose Lane program, and we were going to talk about the idea that they were going to reuse the weapon. Dr. Wood had established that there was this type of energy weapon. And in around July 2007, Michael Chertoff was talking about Al-Qaeda nukes. Stephen E. Jones talked about, in a presentation in Vancouver, talked about an American city being nuked, not by Al-Qaeda but by somebody else, along with Bill Deagle. So they were both saying the same sort of thing, but with different, supposed perpetrators. And we thought they might try and use the weapon again, because they just changed the continuity of government laws as well at the same time. And we wanted to discuss that on the Ambrose Lane program, just that idea. We weren't making a prediction of a date or anything like that. And on the day that we were due to go on, he was fired from his radio program. The telephone call that we were waiting for to go on air never came.
Right, and was this the first time that the Hutchinson effect was going to be discussed on
no,
radio?
it wasn't, but it was just this idea that they were going to reuse the weapon, because the weapon, as Dr. Wood has catalogued, when it's used, looks like a nuclear effect. It looks like a nuclear explosion has gone off.
Right.
And we were trying to make that connection, because they were talking about Al-Qaeda nukes. And it seemingly that was very dangerous to somebody, because he was off his program. He was sacked. He was driving into his parking space that day, and he was sacked from his program.
Right.
So we knew at that point that we were onto something. Something was going on behind the scenes. And I think then to extend that into what you were saying, the Hutchinson effect connection was made by Dr. Wood sort of late 2007, and we discussed that privately. And then in early 2008, we went onto the Ambrose Lane program, a different one, which was his local program, not his national one. In Washington DC, and I actually went across to America and met Dr. Wood, and we went into the studio and we did the broadcast, and I've got a DVD of that, and we discussed the Hutchinson effect evidence, and how you mentioned earlier on, how you had the levitation effects in the Hutchinson effect, and then you had the levitated cars. You had
I can just read it here. The Hutchinson effect is a collection of phenomena discovered accidentally by John Hutchinson in 1979 during attempts to reproduce the work of Nikola Tesla. Hutchinson uses radio frequency and electrostatic sources. The Hutchinson effect occurs in a volume of space where the beams intersect and interfere. The results are levitation of heavy objects, fusion of dissimilar materials such as metal and wood, anomalous melting without heating of metals, without burning adjacent material, spontaneous fracturing of metals, etc. So that's what Hutchinson has found, and it was classified by the Canadian government, some of his research.
Right.
Is that?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the key things. I mean, we had documents from that John had given us, copies of letters from the Canadian government saying that we've been looking at your research, but we're now classifying it as a matter of national security. Mm-hmm. So is that what you do with somebody who's a fraud? Mm-hmm. You know, would you? And prior to, I mean, I knew about the Hutchinson effect in 1999. That's when I'd first come across it. That's when I first heard of it, in a book by Albert Budden, which was called The Electric UFO. And soon after that, in Nick Cook's $1 Billion Secret documentary, which is still available online, you can hear it referred to there. So I was already familiar with John Hutchinson's work by then, and Jim Fetzer claimed that I was taking this for granted. That was another argument I had with him. He said, "No, you're taking this for granted." I said, "No, I've heard about this, Jim."
Now let's just introduce Ace Baker, who is a video expert.
Yeah.
Someone who is good with animation and analysing video footage, that kind of thing, who has analysed some of the news footage that was shown on 9/11.
Right, yeah.
With the objective of exposing false flag terror. So he's one of the truth movement.
He was.
Ace Baker, or is, whatever opinion you want. Now, so he then sends some emails out saying that he has bought or is buying a Tesla coil, which is what's needed to reproduce the Hutchinson effect, and various other pieces of kit. So he puts out this information, and then a short while after, he makes some videos where he's trying to repeat some of Hutchinson's videos, levitate cans of lemonade or that kind of thing, and get metals to fuse together, etc. So he produces some videos and says, "Look, I've duped you, just same way that Hutchinson duped everyone when he made his video." So he's trying to prove that Hutchinson is a fraud. So just expand on that, Andrew.
Well, that was interesting. Again, you know, one of the aspects that comes up in all of this is the timing, because we did this broadcast on the Ambrose Lane show, which was essentially the first time that the connection between 9/11 and the Hutchinson effect was made in public. It was right after that broadcast, I think within a couple of days, that Jim Fetzer, basically started to try and dissociate himself from Judy Ward, or say that Hutchinson was a fraud, and he threatened her. And then Ace Baker, as you said, he came out with this story that he bought a Tesla coil on eBay, and then he'd reproduced the experiments using a Tesla coil and something else. As he said, he made a video. He posted this on YouTube. You look at these videos and they're good quality, they look convincing. You can see he's gone to quite a bit of trouble. One of them uses like a toy doll's house, and he's put some samples in there. He later explained how he did it using magnets, whereby he split the screen, he had a corner of the screen which was just, he did a blue screen or whatever, or just a video mask on it. Mm-hmm. He then set up an upside down film camera, and he filmed things actually falling down. But when you obviously turn the image upside down, it looks like they're going upwards. Right. And that's essentially what he did, and he said, well, that's what John Hutchinson did. Right. And that was his claim. So in other words, his basic claim was, I've produced a video simulating some of the effects that John Hutchinson has, therefore John Hutchinson's videos are fraudulent and he doesn't have an effect. Right.
Now, and Jim Fetzer sided with that analysis.
He did, yes. He basically said, well, I think that Ace is right because he's an expert in video processing, video analysis. And as you mentioned, he'd done this very interesting analysis of the Chopper 5 video from 9/11. So we thought he was on our side. Mm-hmm. And for him to come out, and he essentially then went even further, and he ended up making this $100,000 bet to John Hutchinson to say, look, John, I know you're a fake, so I want you to reproduce the Hutchinson effect for me, and if you can, I want you to levitate this wrench. That was the agreed thing. And they had this,
levitate a wrench?
Yeah, a spanner, yeah.
A spanner.
And if you can do that on demand for me, you'll win the bet. Right. And supposedly an agreement was signed and a bet was made, and there was talk about getting escrow and all this. I didn't follow all of the details. Some of it is in my book. And I think the date was agreed of November the 1st, was it? I can't remember, where Ace Baker would go to John Hutchinson's apartment in New Westminster in Canada to film John Hutchinson doing the levitation experiment, which John set up. He did actually do it. I said to John, don't, this is ridiculous. I don't think you want to accept his challenge because I think he's going to pull some stunt and try and discredit you. That was, that was more or less what I said to John Hutchison. And then Ace Baker never showed up.
Right.
And we'll show another clip here, which John filmed on that day. I've got a couple of clips actually from that day that he filmed when he was set up for Ace Baker, and Ace Baker never showed up.
Okay. Now, I think it is important then for you and Dr. Wood to try and get the Hutchinson effect independently verified, just as an independent voice here for myself.
Yeah.
I mean,
many people
we have spoken about possibly getting John Hutchinson on the show so that he can explain, because he doesn't work in a normal scientific method, does he, Andrew? He doesn't. He doesn't document in detail his experiments.
No,
this is one of the problems.
He's an experimental scientist rather than somebody who he doesn't work for a university. Yeah, and he doesn't have a sort of methodical way of writing everything out, writing a report, publishing a scientific paper. That's not the way he works.
But one thing that you did have, because we were talking off camera, is a list of equipment that he was using. If people, because there may be people watching this show who are absolutely, they've got a Tesla coil in their shed. Maybe they want to have a go.
Right.
Maybe they want to use some equipment at a university that they work at to try and repeat this effect.
Yeah, I mean,
so is there information that an engineer or a scientist can look at in order to try and repeat this effect?
We've got some of that information, but I think, as also we were discussing, John sold a lot of his lab equipment. Again, there's a bit of a story behind that.
We'll try and get a list before this goes out of a list of the equipment that he uses.
Yeah, we're going to try and get a list together. I think, again, I put a list on John's website, or the website that I made for John, which is thehutchisoneffect.com. People can go and look at that anyway, because they'll find lots of interesting information which I've essentially collected on that website, all about the Hutchinson effect.
And we will try and do a telephone interview with yourself, where John can explain in his own words how he creates the effect. Right. Can't get any further than that.
Right, absolutely. But I think, people do ask me the same question. It is a valid question, of course. How can this be reproduced? And there are a couple of difficulties, one of which is that John uses 2 tons of equipment in the past. He actually uses a set of microwave generators, ex-military radar equipment and so on, as you mentioned, a Tesla coil or a Van de Graaff generator.
Now, Dr. Judy Wood's assistant, Michael Zabur, who was helping Dr. Wood, had some inside knowledge of energy technology. Can you expand on that, Andrew?
So it would appear. I mean, when we found this connection between Stephen E. Jones and cold fusion, which we weren't aware of initially, I'd never heard of him in that capacity, but I knew about cold fusion. And so when this came up, I think in 2007, we saw this video of him in this year 2000 documentary called Heavy Watergate. You can see Stephen E. Jones in this documentary mentioned and referenced. And he's mentioned in Eugene Malov's book. Dr. Eugene Malov was a researcher who resigned from Massachusetts Institute of Technology over the cold fusion affair.
Because he knew and could prove that cold fusion worked.
Yes, essentially.
It produced energy from the quantum vacuum or wherever.
Wherever. It's a nuclear. The other thing is it's some type of nuclear reaction. And this is what the Hutchinson effect also seems to create. It's some type of nuclear effect which comes into play both in cold fusion and in the Hutchinson effect. If you look at the way that materials can be transmuted, for example, that's a common element in this.
Now, Eugene Malov was murdered in 2004.
He was, which coincidentally was just over a year before Stephen E. Jones came onto the scene. And Eugene Malov's book mentions Stephen E. Jones on 100 pages. So he knew, he was very familiar with Stephen E. Jones.
Michael Zabur, who had access to Malov's work.
Essentially, he probably would have, because, well, basically, Michael Zabur wanted to tell Dr. Wood that he knew about energy. And it turns out that Michael Zabur had an uncle called William Zabur, who ended up working with Eugene Malov on this New Energy Foundation, which was basically a project they started to try and find research funds for people, for example, like John Hutchison, to continue looking at this new energy technology, this free energy technology.
And Michael Zabur was murdered in 2006.
He was murdered just after Dr. Judy Wood filed the request for correction to NIST, or it was around that time, or around the time they published this paper.
Well, let's come on to that request for correction. I think it was, when was the NIST report submitted?
Well, basically that also involves, I think, involves Stephen E. Jones to an extent, because
2005.
2005, the NIST reports came out. NIST is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. They were given a mandate by Congress and given several $1 million to investigate the destruction of the World Trade Center.
Why did the World Trade Centers disappear?
Right.
For want of a better word.
Right.
That was their remit. They had to produce a scientific report.
Scientific
this
report.
Is official government body.
Correct.
But they employed subcontractors. And can you name those subcontractors, Andrew?
Correct, yeah. They employed 23 subcontractors, but the two most interesting ones are Science Applications International Corporation and Applied Research Associates. Mm-hmm. And both of those companies do research or manufacture of directed energy weapon systems. So, you can go and check that out. You can look at their websites. Applied Research Associates have a contract with the US government to know anything about directed energy weapon systems that any country might have and what their capabilities are.
So the companies that the government employed to write the report on why the towers disappeared are companies who were involved in directed energy weapons research.
Correct, or at least two out of the 23 were. And of course, Boeing were consulted. I don't think Boeing were paid money by NIST, but Boeing are also involved in directed energy weapons research.
Now, so Judy Wood, she read the NIST report and probably laughed at it, I would guess.
Well, to some extent, but you see, Jones came onto the scene just after the NIST reports came out. So my contention is that when these 10,000 pages of reports were put into the public domain, there were going to be figures that, as you alluded to with your sort of actions there, we're going to look at these and think, yeah, there's some very interesting stuff here, and I don't believe this explanation. So it's my contention that Jones was brought onto the scene as part of a sort of package deal, in that he would then say, oh, well, I've looked at these reports, I'm a physicist, and I've seen evidence of thermite. Right. And therefore he could then attract some of the skeptics into his camp and again manage them and know what they were up to.
So Wood and Reynolds, they put in an official request for correction.
That was in
so
2007.
They say, look, this is a flawed report, a NIST report. Please correct it.
Correct.
And they didn't, so they then took legal action.
Correct.
To say that they're committing fraud because
because
it is not scientifically plausible what's in that report.
Right.
So now the fact that these two scientists had tried to sue for science fraud, that was, you were trying to get that on the news, Andrew, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, that's right. And that, we've talked a little bit about that before. I wrote to the BBC Conspiracy Files producer, Mike Rudin, and he basically wanted to get an interview with Dr. Judy Wood for an upcoming program called The Third Tower, which was about the destruction of World Trade Center 7. And he, in his email, he says basically, I just want to have a quick chat with Dr. Wood about her research, and you don't have a quick chat about something this important, on the phone. So we got the feeling they were going to try and do a hit piece, and indeed, as it turned out, the Tower 7 documentary was a hit piece, a big long hit piece. So I was rather glad that we managed to not have Dr. Wood associated with that and not have any of her references or material referred to, because it would have been in the wrong place. And I asked Mike Rudin I asked him basically to make a deal with me. When I heard reports going out on the BBC that 2 US professors had sued US government contractors for fraud over 9/11. When I heard that go out as a headline, I wasn't expecting them to go in any detail. But when I heard that go out on BBC News as a headline, then I would know that he was, being legitimate and honest, and he would get his interview. No such thing ever went out, and he actually said he couldn't get that to happen.
And you had previously written to other BBC producers in the past. I'll just read out a little section here, Andrew. This is in connection with news director Helen Borden.
Oh, yes.
Where you say, regardless, as campaigners, we will continue to reveal the truth about 9/11 to the British public. And I now personally regard the media as a controlled entity and one that is ducking its responsibility. It is therefore my responsibility to spend my own time and money to promulgate the truth about 9/11 being an inside job, and I will, unless this programme changes things, continue to discuss my email exchanges with BBC News director Helen Bowden, who has blatantly ignored evidence and refused opportunities for us to present our evidence in some broadcast vehicle or other. This is now documented and will, if possible, be used to prosecute the BBC for a breach of its charter. So all of this correspondence you've had with the BBC, Andrew, where you've brought it to their attention about the work of Dr. Judy Wood and what really happened on 9/11. They're going to be in court one day, hopefully.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately because, you know, we've made them aware and you've made them aware, other people I know have made them aware. We had this recent program in the summer, the 9/11 Conspiracy Road Trip. Now that was made by a production company called Renegade Productions, I think was the name of it. And I was on, they worked for BBC Three in that capacity. They weren't the BBC, but they were giving the program to BBC Three. And I spoke to one of the researchers on that program for half an hour, and I went through most of what we've gone through, you know, so far. And of course, that was never entered into anything. You know, they never made a comment in the program. It was just all a silly sort of program that they came out with. So, you know, we can prove now that they've had all these opportunities over the last 10 years to put out information which to me is to the same standard as they would use for any other story, yet they refuse to publish it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's come on to some other characters. You mention in your book Alfred Weber, who I have exchanged a few emails with myself. Now, in passing, Dr. Wood made a comment. She said that she was talking about weather modification technology, and she said things such as HARP technology, which is this huge electromagnetic installation in, where is it, in Green
Alaska, Kona, Alaska. Yeah.
Alaska. And there are all kinds of theories about it, that it's used to modify the weather or create earthquakes and this kind of thing. And people seem to latch onto that when she said that. It was almost a throwaway comment. She said, like, she didn't say that HARP was used. And Alfred Weber has since done programs about the theories that HARP was used in 9/11. Can you enlighten us on that, Andrew?
Yeah, well, that again was something which has been taken sort of out of context, I suppose. The main bone that I had with Alfred Weber was that I'd considered he was, again, you know, a bit like the Jim Fetzer character. He was a truth seeker. He wanted to help put out the truth. But then what happened was he actually hosted an interview with Dr. Judy Wood and John Hutchison at his house in February 2008 when Judy went to see John in New Westminster. At that time, John Hutchison actually only lived about 12 miles away from Alfred Weber, coincidentally, and they did an interview together. And so that was an opportunity for him to discover what he needed to discover, both about the Hutchison effect and and Judy Wood's research. However, he didn't broadcast that interview on his program for several months. In fact, the week before he broadcast that interview, he had Richard Gage on his program, which is rather curious. Richard Gage was the architects and engineers figurehead.
We'll come on to him.
Yep. And then later, after that interview had been recorded, Alfred Weber in that interview was very positive, and he was sort of, you know, giving very high sort of complimentary remarks to Dr. Wood and John Hutchison about how this all hung together. But then I think it was a couple of months later he did this interview with this other scientist, or she claims to be a scientist. As I understand, she's not a scientist. She worked in some type of computer systems development at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories in the States.
Lauren Murray.
Loren Murray.
Loren Murray.
Yeah. They did this interview together.
So she was advocating that possibly HARP was used to destroy the towers.
Right. So basically what she did, if you listen to that interview, and it's on...
I've got a quote here. I'll quote it, Andrew. Lauren Murray says, Alfred Weber asks her about the use of HARP to destroy the towers, and Lauren Murray replies, well, it was really Judy Wood's presentation which had the physical evidence and the photos which are not available. They haven't been. And then Weber interrupts and he says, without referring to Judy Wood, in your own words, why do you think HARP caused it? So why is he specifically telling her not to talk about Judy Wood?
Right. And that's an absolutely valid question, and that is the question that we asked ourselves. And I think a follow-on question to that one is, why didn't Lorraine Murray then say, Alfred, why are you asking me not to mention Judy Wood? It was her research that showed me this. That's why I'm mentioning this. But she complies, and then she doesn't mention Judy Wood. This is very, very strange behaviour for two people.
You mentioned the ball analysis earlier, Andrew, which was an animation that I did and an analysis of the NBC, what they call the ball footage. And I'm actually doing work on that now. I'm modifying my theory slightly because I got a lot of feedback from it, and there are a few, shall we say, errors in it. I admit that it's not fully correct. I'm adjusting it, but it's under development, shall we say. Now, Alfred Weber, he saw that video and he wanted to interview me on it, but he wrote a long article about that video, and he mixed in a whole load of other stuff about Tesla technology and about Stargates and all of this sort of stuff. So I said to him, look, I'll be interviewed on your show, because he wanted to interview me, if you rewrite that article and post it to your member base without referring to any of the other stuff that you've mixed in, and tell people that this is a correction. I never heard from him again. So for me, he was trying to mix in a whole load of gibberish with the analysis that I'd done.
Right, and that's the way that this information works, is you get the good material, which is fairly clear cut, and then if you can associate that with stuff that's more woolly or not proven or not provable, then you can dilute the good information, and really in people's minds you can introduce doubt, and that's what this is all about. Now,
doesn't Weber have a military connection at some point?
I don't know exactly what Weber's connections are. He claims to be an international lawyer, but I don't. And I know he's been connected at some time with Stanford Research Institute, SRI, which is also where Colonel John Alexander worked. And Colonel John Alexander, I mentioned him because he went to spend 4 months with John Hutchison in 1983 to investigate John Hutchison's research at that time. So we got some connections there.
Yeah, he does entertain some wild theories on his show. I mean, a lot of people probably think that of this show. Oh, Richard D. Hall, he entertains some wild theories, but I wouldn't agree with that. I like to think that I'm an evidence-based researcher, but one of them, I'll mention his name, Basiago. I don't buy into what he says at all. Time travel, backward time travel. We travelled back in time to get some documents that we left behind, and we travelled forward in time.
I know. I've come across that in a similar way as well. But what ended up going back to that interview with Lorraine Murray that he did. We actually had somebody call in to one of the interviews that Dr. Judy Wood did and said, "Oh, you said that Hart destroyed the World Trade Center," and she said, "No, I didn't. That was somebody doing an impression of me." And she'd heard the Alfred Weber and Lorraine Murray interview, or so it seemed, and assumed that Lorraine Murray was actually Judy Wood because she hadn't heard all of it. So she'd heard all this evidence listed by Lorraine Murray, but then heard the explanation of the only thing that was talked about was Hart, and they didn't mention the Hutchison effect at all, even though Alfred Weber had interviewed John Hutchison in his own house.
Right.
That wasn't mentioned at all in the Lorraine Murray Alfred Weber interview. So why is that? Why is he not mentioning that key evidence? And I think it's because the powers that be need that connection not to be made in the public mindset.
Yeah, this is your contention, that, that the whole cover-up is to keep the energy element of it out of the way.
Correct.
Now, we're coming to a close, Andrew, but I just want to talk about briefly Richard Gage. The one thing I learned about Gage, and Edge Media Television have been repeating his 9/11 lectures. He's an architect who gives the standard controlled demolition thermite story, and for me, he's as bogus as a £6 note. He said that he was asked whether he knew about the seismic activity on 9/11, and he said he hadn't even looked at the data. That he's travelling around the world, all different countries, giving these 9/11 truth lectures, and he hasn't bothered to check whether there was a seismic trace. Now, for me, that's a key thing, that someone who is supposedly scientifically putting information forward about 9/11, did the buildings make a clatter when they hit the ground, and how long did it last for, and what was the size of that clatter, basically? And he hasn't even looked at that. He isn't even aware of the trace.
Well, that's right. I mean, he even, we have another video of him, and if my memory is correct on that particular one, he says the reason why he doesn't discuss the seismic data is he doesn't understand it. Mm-hmm. And that's what he actually says in this video clip. Yeah. So, and there are many issues with Richard Gage. You know, basically, I've written about this on my website, and we have this interview where he describes Dr. Judy Wood's research. He described Dr. Judy Wood as practicing witchcraft because she won't talk about these iron microspheres, which is nonsense, because if you look on page 332 of her book, you'll find the iron microspheres are discussed in her book. So he's lying about that. And the list with Gage goes on and on. You know, I mean, I've got quite a lot of information on him now.
Sure. Okay, well, I mean, there's other names on this, on my notes here, Andrew, as well, people who would possibly be surprised at, but we've run out of time, unfortunately, but perhaps we can discuss those if we do another interview at some point with John Hutchinson, so that John Hutchinson can describe in his own words how he creates the Hutchinson effect, and then perhaps we can get someone who's got either the funding or the technical knowledge to be able to repeat that, and then we could put that one to bed effectively. That would vindicate you and Dr. Wood. Right.
You know, I mean, basically, as far as we see things, because we've seen all these attempts to cover this up, we know this is the right thing. You know, because of the way that this has been treated by all these figures, we know this is we're over the target.
And just to finish, Andrew, how can people get your book?
Well, the book is available for free download from my website, checktheevidence.com. You'll find it in the 9/11 section.
So they can get it for free online?
Yeah, you can get it as a free download.
And I believe when people, if they purchase Where Did the Towers Go, they get a free copy on CD.
That's right. I've made it into an audio book, and I've been including the audio CD version of it, or MP3 CD, I should say, and also the PDF file. You get that with Where Did the Towers Go if you get that book. And the book is available on Lulu. So if you want the paperback version, I think it works out to about £9, including postage or something.
All right, Andrew. Thanks very much. Enlightening as usual. And it just remains for me to say, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.